It's another interesting episode of Labor Lens where we bring to you updated information in the world of work and pay. I am Sharon Ijason. On this week's episode of the program, we'll be discussing about the changing dynamics in the future of work in West Africa. We will be right back. Africa's most populous country and largest economy, Nigeria, has been battling youth unemployment problem for years. Nearly a quarter of the population is out of work and 20% is underemployed. For young people aged 15 to 35, the figure is grim, as 55.4% of them are without work. Creating jobs was one of the key issues that dominated this year's election campaign, but has government been able to fulfill its promises to the youths? In the quest to find answers to this nagging question, I met with Abimbola Ajayi. She tells me she is a chemical engineering graduate from the Federal University of Technology, Owerri, in Imo State, southeast Nigeria.
I've applied several advertisements online. I've applied severally, and I've not gotten.
A person is said to be unemployed when such is unable to find a job, even when he is actively searching for one and is capable and willing. According to research, Nigeria needs to be industrialized to check this trend. Lack of this is said to be responsible for the vicious cycle of poverty in the country in terms of low-level industrialization, low turnout of graduates competent in science and technology, low manpower development, poor income and low-level investment.
Or is there still more of a tendency to say, we can't?
At a workshop in Lagos, southwest Nigeria, tagged Africa Talent Hunt, some human resource managers shared their experience about recruiting people.
So I think the issue with Africa is don't rely on the traditional corporates, the financial services companies, the oil and gas companies, the FMCGs, because opportunity is restricted there. They are always going to be looking to drive efficiencies, and driving efficiency to an extent means more automation and fewer people. So the opportunities for growth from a talent point of view are basically going to be outside of your traditional corporates.
First thing is to always make sure you have a profile. All right, so right now in 2019, there's so many different ways that people can find out about your skills, your experiences, and your capabilities. And the best way for that to happen is through a digital profile. So it's extremely important that you create profiles on the platforms that HR executives are actually looking to find people. So this can be on Jobberman, for example, which is a career services platform. You create a profile on there, put your skills, your experiences, your desires, and it's easy for people to actually search for that capability and that experience and find you.
After working for 4 years as a contract staff in one of Nigeria's commercial banks, Abimbola Ajayi is thinking of becoming an entrepreneur. But there are challenges.
What I want to go into needs clean water, very clean water. And if I don't have source of good water, I don't think I'll be able to do the standard. I keep the standard of what I want to produce. So if the government could just help in all that with infrastructure, basic amenities, then I think people there'll be more entrepreneurs.
Unemployment became a source of worry in the country after the Nigeria Civil War in 1970. The problem became more pronounced with the introduction of Structural Adjustment Program (SAP), which advocated the removal of government subsidies, rationalization of government expenditure, as well as privatization of the public sector of the economy. For Abimbola Ajayi and other unemployed youth, they hope there will be reliable database to help strengthen government policies to tackle unemployment. Many economists and social commentators are of the view that the pitfall of unemployment can be blamed for crimes and rising insecurity in the country. The current government is tackling the rising unemployment rate in the country with interventionist social investment programs like the N-Power and Trade and Money, but is still a long way out of the unemployment woes in Nigeria.
Workers in Nigeria and workers in the United States are facing the same challenges: precarious work, the failure of having a vibrant social contract. We're here to say we are going to reinvigorate that social contract, demanding that all workers have rights, have dignity, have social protections. We heard from Brother Ayuba that most workers in the world don't even know they have those rights. And so we are here to demand of the governments and employers of the world that we are here to get a new contract, to work with them and make sure it's implemented in all of our countries. We have the biggest issue, which is there's not even equal pay for women doing the same types of work. And we're here to negotiate the most historic treaty our world has ever seen to end violence and harassment in the world of work. The numbers are astonishing. There is not a sector and there is not a country where this is not an egregious problem. Women experience it whether they have to risk their lives to get a job with a male manager or the day-to-day aggressions they face in the workplace. Many governments have no laws to protect them.
Some of the things that have been most important to us have been given the changes in the world of work, how to ensure that workers' rights, fundamental rights, remain preserved, and that the work of the ILO will always be centered on the promotion of workers' rights. And there have been various issues that have brought this to the fore. We have won some, we have lost some in terms of adopting wordings. But generally, we are looking forward to having a resolution adopted at the end of the work of the committee that will meet the aspirations of the working group.
Generally, one, we agree that innovation is the order of the day anywhere in the world, both in developed and developing countries. But one aspect we just have to be careful is the issue of digitalization. Because if you draw a quick conclusion on digitalization, you may also be cutting short the expectation of Africa. A developing country, in as much as we agree that the use of technology is quite apt in order to fast track and attain our expectation, we should also be mindful of the fact that whatever program we drive should be labor intensive, because we have unemployment challenge in Africa, especially in Nigeria. Unemployment problem will be better solved when more people are involved in driving programs. And that is why the use of people than robots is what I advocate for Africa. I agree with the world that digitalization is coming, but I don't think it's coming to replace the work of man in Africa. So that is where I have a challenge. And in as much as we are supporting the program, we are also conscious that what we need as a country today is to solve unemployment problem. And I don't think robots can do that for us. So whatever we do, we must believe that everyone belongs to a class in terms of development.
On the Profile Interview segment this week, I will be speaking with the International Labour Organization Country Director of Nigeria, Ghana, Liberia and Sierra Leone. Dennis Zulu spoke extensively on the future of work in Africa. It's good to have you on the program.
Thank you, good to be here.
Very interesting. I'm meeting you for the first time, and I'm aware that you've been involved in the struggle towards decent work in Africa and in the global space at large. Can you share with us, particularly in Africa, what your experience has been in terms of ensuring that workers across the globe actually have decent wage, decent work for all?
Okay, we, as you know, the ILO is a specialized agency of the United Nations whose primary mandate is to work with member states in the promotion of decent work. Our work in Africa is primarily focused on supporting member states in dealing with the usual challenges of higher unemployment, workers' rights violations in the workplace, the whole discussion around social dialogue, which is the promotion of a partnership between employers and workers coming together to discuss issues of mutual interest. We're also working very closely with many member states on issues of social protection, specifically focusing on social security, because we believe that any worker beyond their work life is entitled to a certain level of living, and therefore they need to prepare for a rainy day. So working with different institutions across Africa to support them in providing adequate social security benefits. Now, reference to the challenges, obviously the biggest challenge is unemployment, and this is the same across many African countries, as is the case across the world. Africa is a growing population, most of it is young. Obviously, not sufficient jobs are being created despite the fairly impressive levels of economic growth in many countries, but unfortunately this growth is what we call jobless. With increasing numbers of young people leaving training and tertiary institutions yearly, it's become very difficult for them to find placements in jobs across the continent. So what we've seen is a growing, what we refer to an informal economy. So they're finding alternatives or finding other options, which is basically working outside from what we normally refer to as the formal economy. So you see them setting up small businesses, working in markets, doing all sorts of things to keep themselves busy, but also to take care of the livelihoods.
So can you tell us, how sustainable is that?
Well, definitely. I mean, what the ideal case would be for young people to get jobs in the formal economy. And in the formal economy, that's where we see decent work being guaranteed. And therefore, the ILO has been working over the years, culminating into what we call the transition from informality to formality, which is a recommendation which was adopted recently by the ILO. And really, this lays out various strategies on how we can work with the informal economy and ensure that the young people working in the formal economy transit to the formal economy. This will not happen overnight, but what we're trying to do is ensure that as they work in the informal economy, they benefit from the basic tenets of what we refer to as decent work, which is ensuring that they have equal opportunities to employment, their rights as workers in the informal economy are protected. They have some element of social security beyond their work life, but also that they engage in some social dialogue. Because even in the informal economy, you find an employer and an employee. So they should be able to discuss their conditions of work, which are mutually agreed, but also for the benefit of either one of them. So that's really the plan. But unfortunately, as I said, most of Africa's youth are working in the informal economy, and this is undisputed. So we really need to be working hard and ensuring that we support the informal economy, so hopefully they can transit into what we're calling the formal economy.
From what you just said now, it's obvious that it's the informal sector whereby we have more job opportunities. Would you say that Africa leaders have been able to harness these potentials that many young people actually have?
Well, what we're saying is that ideally, as I stated earlier, we should really be promoting decent jobs. And decent jobs are found in the formal economy. So the consequence of the absence of number of jobs in the formal economy means that the informal economy is now seen as the outlet for young people, because they can then easily go into the informal economy, start their own businesses, or work for other young people who've opened small businesses in the informal economy. So how can we work towards ensuring that the informal economy is improved, so as to say, to ensure that even those who work in this informal economy benefit from decent work? Ultimately, with the objective of ensuring that after some time they transit into the formal economy, where there's observance of workers' rights, there's equal opportunities, then issues of security are dealt with, and also social dialogue is the norm. So the other way of dealing with it will be to ensure that we create sufficient number of jobs in the private sector, so that we do not have young people falling or moving on to the informal economy, and that will take a bit of doing. But in some cases, you've seen that there's been some growth in terms of numbers employed in the formal economy in some countries. In the case of Nigeria, I think the statistics show by the National Bureau of Statistics is that there's actually been an increase in the number of young people unemployed, which is a source of concern. But I'm glad that recently the government is looking at creating, I think, approximately 100 million jobs in a certain period of time. But that will need a lot of work. It will need providing the enabling environment for the private sector to grow. As we know, the private sector really should be the engine of growth, and the engine of growth means more jobs. And so we need to work with what we have at the moment, and this to ensure that if indeed the informal economy is growing, what can we do to ensure that the conditions are improved? The young people, the informal economy, or the conditions that drove them from formal to informal are dealt with, so that we don't see this growth in the informal, but a growth in the formal economy where the rights and all these other benefits accruing from decent work are realized or can be achieved.
To many people, this may actually sound vague, but in practical terms, what do you think needs to be done to ensure that there's no skill gap in the labor market? Because from my observation, there are lots of jobs, even though people say there are no jobs, but it's about filling up those space with appropriate people. In practical terms, with your level of experience, what would be your expectations for any African country in terms of ensuring that we have the right people in the right place, and we don't have a lot of job vacancies that might probably be filled up by expatriates because we don't have local people to do these jobs?
All right, yes, indeed, the statistics show that there's what is referred to as the skills mismatch in a number of African countries. This really arises from the fact that there's initiatives targeted towards training young people in various vocations and giving them sufficient skills in whatever areas. But then the question is whether these skills that are being provided to young people across the different training institutions really are those skills that the private sector wants. And you'll see that in a number of cases, indeed, that's the issue. The private sector claims, and indeed in certain cases it's been proven that the jobs are there, but the type of skills that the young people have do not necessarily match the demands of the private sector. And because of this, you find that these jobs remain unfilled, and you find that young people remain on the streets without jobs. So what then can we do to ensure that we are churning out what are referred to as demand-driven skills? The important the players in this case are the training institutions and the private sector, because the private sector really is the one that demands the skills. So they need to be in consistent dialogue with the training institutions and providing inputs in the curriculums, and also supporting the training of trainers to ensure that the training institutions and universities and the technical institutions train young people who can hit the ground running, so as to say. So we help facilitate this linkage between training institutions and the private sector, so that there's a consistent dialogue and exchange of ideas, as well as ensuring that the students have prior experience, for instance, with placements in the private sector, apprenticeship schemes, which empower them to actually acquire the certain level of skill that the private sector will require. So the skills mismatch issue is there, but I think there's now a realization that something needs to be done, and I see more and more private sector engagement with the training institutions to ensure that this does not persist.
Can you share with us what the International Labour Organization is doing in terms of helping member states to address the issue of child labor?
Well, indeed, child labor is the continuous problem that we have across the continent. Again, in many countries you see young people, or young children actually in this case, working for a number of reasons. In most cases, the reason is that in a number of countries, children have to work to support livelihoods of their families, and really because of this, you find that parents look up to children to provide extra incomes. Now, the problem is that children shouldn't be working at that young age. Children should be in school, acquiring the necessary education that will help them get to tertiary institutions, acquire the right skills that will help them contribute to the growth of Africa, and specifically their countries. Now, by depriving children of the opportunity to go to school, you're basically saying to them that your future is bleak, because then they'll not have the necessary education to qualify to tertiary institutions to get the right skills to contribute to economic growth. children should be able to enjoy their childhood like every other child across the world. But also I think most significantly is the fact that for every job that a child does, it means an adult is not working. So that's the side of it that we need to look at also very seriously. So let's get the children into school and enjoying their young lives, and get the adults to do the jobs that the children are doing. In certain cases, you find one of the contributing factors to child labor is the fact that some employers understand and know very well that children do not have the power to negotiate and bargain. So what better way of getting your business going than employing a child who can't negotiate or bargain for a proper wage, which is basically exploiting the child or forcing the child into child labor. So we've done quite a lot in terms of working with different member states. Nigeria is one of those that has been, despite the huge problem of child labor in Nigeria has done very well. We've got a national child labor policy. We've got what is called a hazardous list, which basically stipulates the worst forms of child labor that are basically outlawed in Nigeria. We've worked with law enforcement agencies and communities to be able to spot incidents of child labor, working with families to ensure that they do not or are sensitized against forcing their children into child labor. But even in situations where families are forced into sending their children because they do not have adequate resources for their livelihoods, working with those families, providing them alternative livelihoods so that they do not send children but rather cope and fend for themselves in this instance. The challenge is big, and unfortunately, despite all this work, there's still I think a trend towards an increase in child labor, but hopefully we know that, and we hope that given all this work that's been done by the different partners in Nigeria, the government itself through the Federal Ministry of Labor and Employment, but as well as trade unions, Nigerian Labour Congress, Trade Union Congress, and the employers, who collectively are part and parcel of this initiative. We hope that sooner rather than later we'll see a decline in the child labor prevalence in Nigeria.
Okay, digitalization is one big issue, and there are lots of concerns by workers on the possibility of robots taking away their jobs. What's ILO doing in terms of probably keeping workers' job or educating workers on probably new career paths that won't keep them out of work?
Okay. Well, the ILO this year at the International Labour Conference launched what is called the Declaration on the Future of Work. The future of work is really looking at what drivers will influence the workplace as we know it today. And I think you correctly stated that technology is one of those drivers, in addition to demographic change, demographic trends rather, climate change and globalization. Technology is talked about the most, and there's, I know, fears that technology will basically replace a lot of our workers in the workplace. But what we're really advocating for is technological developments that work to make work easier rather than to replace workers. So you're really looking towards a technology that supports workers' efficiencies. But we do recognize the fact that in some cases, jobs will be lost towards to technology, but we also realize that jobs also be gained in alternative areas of work, including the growth in what we call the green economy. This is really jobs that are created as a result of the movement to ensure that we do not continue harming our environment. I'm talking here about work in the renewable energies, where we've seen a growth in alternative energy sources away from oil and gas, for instance, into, in the case of cars, we're seeing now electric cars, we're seeing solar-powered houses and production. So all those are basically taking some slack off the number of jobs that will be lost as a result of using what is referred to as dirty energy, which is coal and things like that. But I think we also need to be equipped and prepared for the future. And this is why the ILO, as part of the report, advocates for what's referred to as lifelong skills. So we should consistently encourage workers and through their workers' organizations to continuously improve themselves, acquire the necessary knowledge in terms of technology or skills pertaining to technology, so that they face a better chance, if I may say, in terms of guaranteeing their jobs. So that's what we're basically saying. We do recognize as the ILO that technology is one of those drivers, but we need to be prepared for that. How do we do that? Provide the necessary skills development, and member states of the ILO and the UN in particular should take that initiative, prepare our people the right skills for the future.
During the 2019 ILC conference, which was held in Geneva, Switzerland, President Emmanuel Macron proposed a universal wage for European workers. Do you think that is practicable in Africa?
Well, I mean, it's possible, but I think you need to look at this the two differently. The Europeans obviously have the European Union, which basically sets or provides policy directions in all sorts of areas, including employment. In Africa, unfortunately, we have not reached that stage where we have one framework within which we all operate. And because of that, it might be a bit of a challenge. Of course, with the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which was signed recently, maybe that's some of the things they'll be looking at. But I think we're still a bit off from that, given I see the diversity of the African continent as opposed to EU in terms of the levels of economic development. I mean, across Africa we have different sorts of levels of development. We have least developed countries, or then we have what I refer to as lower or least, or I don't think the least, underdeveloped, if you want to call it that. And we've got some countries that are doing fairly well in terms of if you look at how they're doing economically. So it would be fairly difficult, I think, to have a wage which captures all the different diversities and levels of development across the continent of Africa, to have that universal wage, because there's also ability to pay, which is dependent on the state of the economy in that country. So it's easier for the European Union or President Macron to prescribe that for Europe, but it might be very difficult for us in Africa to do that, given the different levels of economic development, but also the different levels of even the different levels of skills. You will note that sometimes we even have challenges in terms of acceptability of skills that are gotten in training institutions in Nigeria, for instance, might not necessarily be accepted in Sierra Leone or vice versa. So those are some of the challenges we might have to deal with in terms of the wage. I mean, look at the current discussions around the minimum wage in Nigeria. Different states have said they're not able to pay, or said before they're not able to pay, and others are able to pay. So those are some of the complexities that we might face with having a universal wage across the continent of Africa.
Thank you very much for your time on the program.
My pleasure.
And that's all we can take on today's edition of the program. Join us next week for a fresh edition of the show. I am Sharon Ijason. Thanks for watching, and remember, labor creates wealth.